The deconstructionists, or leftists, or whatever you want to call it, that are destroying and deconstructing our society, one of their main goals is to deconstruct the nuclear family. And that's very evident because the family is the cornerstone of the community is the cornerstone of the nation. And I really want to focus on that point, and that Lad Society right now is focus on being an individual organization. It's about self-improvement, it's about getting your life together, getting your act together, and from there, once that's all on board, it's about building that family, building that network, and from there, we build a physical community out of these families. And once we have a physical community, we have one in Melbourne, or maybe we have two in Melbourne, and we have one in Sydney, and we have one out in the country, and we have one in Brisbane, and these communities together will build our nation. When the Jews, before they had Israel in the 20s and 30s, they used to consider themselves as a nation. Now, they were spread across the whole world, mostly across Europe, and including, New York and North Caulfield here in Melbourne. But they always considered themselves a nation. Even though they did not have a physical space, they occupied little minor spaces, little micronations, and that collection of micronations was a nation in itself. And that's how we need to behave. We focus on ourselves, we build our families, we build our communities, and that collection of communities eventually will become physical space like Israel. And that is the end goal of what our organization is, and what all networks of young white men should be trying to achieve, whether they're Lads or any other organization for that. And one thing, as I was saying before, that the left wish to destroy is that first stage, that building of the family, that nuclear family, and all the values and all the beliefs that come out of living as a family. And I agree in part with the destruction of the nuclear family, but in the opposite direction. I do not believe the nuclear family is sustainable. I do not believe the nuclear family is the peak of what we as an Anglo-European society should adhere to. It is not the be-all and end-all. It is actually very negative. It's hyper-individualistic, and it removes, it creates huge cultural and economic issues. Now, I'm thinking some long-term planning when I'm talking about culture-changing economics, okay? Because we currently live in a very highly indebted society. We live in a society with huge taxation, with huge services that are really unnecessary if we change culture. We don't need to have a pension. Okay, if we combined, the principles of superannuation with a cultural solution, which is to make sure that we expand the nuclear family. We have to throw nuclear in the dust, or the nucleus, and create the cell. The nucleus is just one part of a bigger picture, and that's what we need to focus on. We need to build bigger families, not just in the children that we're having, but when we are grandparents, we need to be actively involved and create a culture where we're still involved directly in that family, and that you don't just, as soon as you have kids and those kids have kids, you just sort of like semi out of the picture, and you see them once a week or once a month, or in my case, I used to only see my grandparents once every 2 years because they were in a different country. And this needs to be really abolished. It needs to be a thing of the past, where we've learned from the mistakes of the hyper northern European hyper individualistic economics of consumerism, but also the hyper individualistic cultural aspects of the destruction of the natural family. Now, I'm sure someone has the word for what the opposite of the nuclear family is, the family that operates with aunties and uncles and cousins, but for now I'm just going to call it the WOG family. We really need to learn from the Mediterraneans, from the Southern Europeans, and install this value system where we maintain this extended family in close proximity. Because if your extended family isn't in close proximity to each other, then the cornerstone of community doesn't exist. And that's why we don't have the communities that we have anymore. And there was a time, not even 100 years ago, I think only maybe 35 years ago, sorry, not 35, 85 years ago, 80 years ago, where we didn't even have social welfare in this country. Because we had charities, we had tight-knit communities, and every suburb was an extension of, it was its own little autarkic system. It was its own little town. you know, whether it be Kew or Camberwell or Sunbury or whatever it is, you know, any suburb you can name in Melbourne, or Frankston, they were not considered Melbourne. Melbourne was the city, Melbourne was the CBD, and these suburbs, which historically represented each train station out of Melbourne, represented their own little microcosm, their own little town. Now, as we got more crowded, these towns started completely connecting, and we're starting to see that now. This process is still going on. You know, 5 years ago, you would consider Melton. You know, it's a different part of Victoria. It's not part of Melbourne. Now Melton has blurred through the lines, and it's basically part of Melbourne. You know, I hear Blair all the time talk about going to Melbourne, and I think to myself, you're in Melbourne, what are you talking about? But because he comes from Frankston, and Frankston's so far away from Melbourne, he's got this Frankston mindset, which has been there for 100 years, that Frankston's separate to Melbourne. It's a separate city, it's a separate town. And you know, when he says, oh, I'm going up to Melbourne tomorrow, I sort of think for a second, what does he mean by this? But it's that old school principles of, hey, I live in my own little town, and we need to do the same thing. This was brought up a couple of days ago. When a terrorist attack happens, oh yeah, it's terrible, but it's not in my town. We need to create our own little town, our own little network, and it might just exist as a suburb that we colonize within our capital cities. And it's like, well, we don't have a crime problem where we are. We don't have a crime problem in our city. It's like, oh, but you're part of Melbourne. It's like, well, no, not really. We're our own town. We do our own thing. We got our own community. We got our own autarkic small business, our own economic and cultural independence. And this is the cornerstone of our success. Is doing the basics right and going back to our roots, but not just going back to our roots, because part of Lat society is not just preservation, it's adaptation. We must adapt, we must take from other cultures, whether they be other European cultures, like the Southern Europeans, or whether it be Islam or Judaism and their economic autarky and their economic tribalism. We must take these things and we must package them all together, and that's how we're going to win. So I want that to be something that we think about, not just the economic autarky, but also this creation of a new family model, and this creation of a parallel society in our own psyche, where we say, well, you know, that terrorist attack, yeah, that's terrible, but it doesn't happen in my country. It's not in my country. That's not my country. We must separate ourselves from the wider Australia, and we must get as many of the normies that are of the right stock and the right mentality, and obviously of the right principles and values, or close enough, and get them on board into our society and say, hey, welcome to our world. This is a different way of living, and this is a more successful and happy and healthy and stronger model of living. And this is how we're going to preserve what must be preserved, which is obviously our identity and our heritage. Anyway, have a good day, guys, and, you know, keep thinking.